I'm sure this is going to be a very worthy successor to the 1973 colloque, which is the book that inspired my interest in the Rif War and led me to do a PhD thesis on the war in the first place. And today I'd like to suggest a slightly different way of looking at the Rif War, and this is to situate the war in relation to the history of piracy in North Africa. And the central question I would like to ask is, what happened to piracy during the Rif War? And there are two main aims in this talk. The first is to remind us that, of course, the war was fought out in the maritime space. It was fought at sea as well as on land. And the second, perhaps more important question, is to ask what the war tells us about piracy and its long, slow twilight in North Africa. And in terms of a conceptual approach to piracy, which we could loosely define as robbery with violence or the threat of violence at sea, I'd like to consider the relationship of the state with piracy. There's a number of possible ways in which a state can deal with the issue of piracy. They can range from suppressing it to ignoring it, tolerating piracy in some circumstances, or even embracing piracy. And my approach in relation to northern Morocco has been informed by a number of works which deal with this ambiguity of the state's relationship with pirates. As the title of the Maroc collection from the early 90s suggests, there's a range between corsairing and maritime jihad. And that, I think, illustrates the range of responses to piracy, the tension between treating piracy as essentially a criminal activity to legitimating it as a form of state-sponsored warfare or as religiously sanctioned warfare. In one extreme case, explored by Peter Lambourne Wilson in his book, the wonderful book, Pirate Utopias, he explored the idea that piracy can be an expression of a new kind of social order. And he based his research largely on the Republic of Saleh in 17th century Morocco to argue that a community of pirates and renegades, of European converts to Islam, created a pirate republic with its own rules distinct from European and Moroccan states at the same time. So in effect, piracy can help to reshape or to reform the state itself. In contrast, many of you will be familiar with Richard Pennell's work on the Republic of the Reef. Richard Pennell's later work was on piracy in 19th century Morocco. And Pennell explored the end of the attacks authorized directly by the Moroccan Sultanate, which ended in the 1830s, and a shift instead towards small-scale predatory coastal raiding by pirates, especially in northern Morocco, among the Galaya, which were outside the direct control of the Moroccan state, and which were tolerated but sometimes suppressed, often depending on the need to placate European diplomats. So we have the whole range of responses to the issue of piracy. And turning now to the existence of piracy in northern Morocco before 1921, it's my view that it's one of the great misunderstandings around piracy in the Western Mediterranean is the idea that it ended in the early 19th century or the mid-19th century or even the late 19th century. The conventional view is that the final outbreak of piracy was among the Bakoya villages in the 1890s, and that ended with an expedition sent by the Mahsen under Busht al-Baghdadi in 1898 to destroy the Bakoya villages. And then the attacks on European shipping stopped. And that is conventionally treated as the end of piracy in Morocco. But this is, in my view, a misunderstanding. In fact, piracy re-emerged in northern Morocco before the First World War. And I've called this period the Republic at Sea. And as Professor Rive discussed yesterday, this was the period characterized in collective memory by David Montgomery Hart's informants as the Republic, a time of anarchy and breakdown in the social order. This was the political crisis of the Sultanate under Abdelaziz in the 1900s, when he saw the rise of disorder in rural areas and an increase in banditry. So it's not surprising, therefore, that piracy, which is, to use Richard Pennell's expression, banditry at sea, piracy re-emerged during this time. And we see a very similar model of pirate behavior to the 19th century. So European fishing boats and cargo ships and even a Spanish warship, the General Concha in 1913, were attacked. They have engine trouble, they get becalmed in light winds, or they run aground near the Rifian coast. Small boats put up from the coast armed with local sailors armed with rifles, and they attack and board the ships. The crews are seized and held for ransom in the coastal villages. And this was going on right up till 1921. These aren't big numbers, but they are comparable to earlier outbreaks of piracy in the 19th century. And I should say that these figures are probably underestimates. These figures are taken largely from the British and Spanish diplomatic archives. I think you probably could find more figures if you explored in the French, Belgium, and Dutch archives. They also don't include smugglers who may not have reported attacks, and they don't include the largest volume of piracy, which would have been attacks on local shipping. So effectively, Rifian pirates preying upon Rifian boats. So there's a strong case that piracy was flourishing among the coastal communities of the Rif before 1921. The question then becomes, what happened to piracy during the Rif War? Well, we shouldn't forget that the start of the war was marked by an act of piracy. On the 15th of July 1921, just 1 week before the great victory at Anwar, a Spanish merchant ship, Antonio Torres, was seized by Rifian sailors off the Bucoyo coast. It was surrounded and seized by sailors led by a well-known pirate and smuggler, Mohammed Abdallah. One crewman was killed. The rest of the crew were held for ransom, and they were held in the same camp as Spanish prisoners of war from Anwar. But here we come to the central paradox of the talk, which is that the attack on the Antonio Torres was the last significant act of piracy during the war. In fact, there was a dramatic drop in piracy from 1921. And I've only identified a single act of piracy during the 5 years of the Rif War. And that was when a crew of Rifians tried to seize a seaplane from the Spanish Navy, which crash landed in the sea near Tiguizas. And it's highly symbolic, in my view, that this final act of the traditional use of piracy was an attack on a seaplane, of all things, that collision between two different worlds. But this single incident doesn't disguise the fact that there was a significant drop-off in piracy during the war itself. And that's something that's also evident in contemporary accounts from European sources. It's striking how rarely Rifians are labelled as pirates during the war. If you look at European newspapers during the 1850s, 1840s, 1890s, it's very common to refer to the stereotype of Rifians being pirates. But during the Rif War itself, it's very rare for Rifians to be called pirates. And I think that's simply because there was very little piracy going on. The question then becomes why? Why did piracy drop during the Rif War? And I think there's two very good practical reasons and one speculative, more interesting reason. The first is the huge disparity in force. Abdelkrim, as Mathieu mentioned yesterday, Abdelkrim created a small Rifian regular army. He also created a small regular Rifian fleet, which was very small, consisted of only 25 to 30 sailors. They're recorded in the account books of the Republic of the Rif, which are now in the diplomatic archives in Nantes. They were paid at the same level as Rifian regular soldiers. And they were used to transport troops and supplies along the coast. They travelled at night to avoid naval patrols and aircraft, and they hid during the day undercover on beaches. But you contrast that small number of rowing boats and 2 motorboats with this kind of very small shipping, often with boats only 6 meters long, the size of a small yacht or small motorboat. You compare that with the Spanish Navy. There is no comparison. The Spanish Navy at this time was modernizing fast, using aircraft carriers for the first time and using naval aviation, new innovative technology. And that's even more true of the French Navy, which of course was among the leading naval powers in the world. So it would have been completely impractical for Rifian boats to attempt to attack European warships, even gunboats. And that may be indicative, and I don't know if Mohammed will speak about this, that there's no serious attempt by the Rif to acquire a warship, unlike its various attempts to acquire aircraft. It's also likely, and this is the second practical reason, there were fewer targets. There was less commercial shipping near the coast. It's probably the case that ships' captains began to avoid even more so the Rifian coast, and the ships were keeping well clear. But there's a third, perhaps more speculative reason, more profound reason, which is it is possible that freelance piracy, which, like banditry, was regarded as a symptom of disorder by the state, piracy increased and decreased at key points in the 19th century, depending on the willingness or capacity of the Moroccan Sultanate to exert force or to negotiate with pirates in the north. Therefore, I'm going to suggest that the creation of a state in the Rif by Mohammed bin Abdul Karim also meant the end of the so-called republic at sea. Coastal society and the coastal economy were centralized and harnessed to the Rifian war machine. Piracy as a freelance activity became incidental and possibly contradictory to Rifian war aims. And there's several bits of evidence I'm going to add to suggest this. And this is a map showing the harbours, the Piracy, used by local sailors at the time immediately before the Rif War, often very, very small anchorages, only accessible to tiny boats, some of which don't even appear on nautical charts nowadays. They're just far too small. And I should add that this map is based on data collected by a young French naval lieutenant who we mentioned yesterday, Robert Montaigne. Montaigne was very active in French naval intelligence in 1924, 1925, and he used a network of local informants to gather this data. One of the things Montaigne found was that before the Rif War, 5 large harbours were treated as safe harbours, according to Rifian custom, where shipping could not be attacked by local pirates. That's somewhat similar to the role in the Rif of markets on land as safe places where any breach of the peace or any violence would be punished rigorously. But everywhere else outside those safe harbours, he calls them port de voyage, travelling harbours, boats risked being attacked either at anchor or along the coast, especially the Begoya coast. And I'd speculate that after 1921, and unfortunately Robert Montaigne doesn't really go into this to elaborate this theory, and I've never seen it in his later writings. It's not discussed by Carlton Coon or Montgomery Hart or any of the other anthropologists, but I'd speculate that after 1921, bin Abdul Karim may have acted to stamp out piracy, especially piracy against local shipping. The Rifian state was dependent on the sea to transport munitions, to transport supplies and people, to carry Rifian delegations to Tangier. So he needed to keep the coastal routes clear of pirates, just as he would have kept the roads clear of bandits. Therefore, piracy became a threat to the Rifian state, and this customary distinction of safe harbours was ended, and the coast came under the nominal control of the Rifian state. And in parallel to what Mathieu was talking about yesterday, Abdul Karim co-opted the pirate networks. There was a process of negotiation and payoffs, if you like, to win over notable pirates to the Rifian cause. And the most outstanding example was Masoud bin Amar, also known as Sibara, nicknamed after a Spanish admiral, who was a notorious pirate from the 1890s onwards. And he became the first Qaid, the first captain of the Rifian fleet, appointed by Abdul Karim and paid by him until his death in 1924. So there's a process of domesticating pirates and bringing them within the remit of the Rifian state. As well as those payoffs and effectively putting pirates on the salary or the payroll of the Rif, the Republic of the Rif. And again, I was struck by the parallels with what Mathieu was discussing yesterday. There was a very repressive side to this too. Abdul Karim created a network of watchtowers, garrisons, and gun emplacements at key locations along the coast. Partly, this was geared towards defence. There was a system of coastal artillery using former Spanish guns to attack European warships that got too close to the coast. And notably, coastal artillery sank a Spanish merchant ship, the Juan de Juanes, in 1922. They were noted for the accuracy of their gunning. And if you go to the Spanish Naval Museum in Madrid, even today, they have a relic from the Alfonso XIII battleship, which shows the impact of Rifian gunnery on the bridge of the Spanish battleship. But those garrisons and those watchtowers were also intended for internal control. So this was a system of maritime surveillance, so they could watch who was coming up and down the coast, Rifian shipping as well as European shipping, to ensure that the Republic of the Rif and not its potential local rivals had exclusive control of the coast. Abdul Karim also organised the seizure of local boats and concentrated them in the larger harbours of the Rif. And here you can see in a Spanish aerial photograph, you can see just about the Rifian boats in sheds hauled up on the beaches just underneath the cliffs in a harbour on the coast. And in particular, they were collected in two harbours along the coast where they could be under the watchful gaze of Rifian officials who controlled access to the boats. That is typified by Abdelkrim's treatment of the two so-called pirate villages of the Bukoya and the Galaya. There's an ambiguous relationship with the Bukoya, which provided some of the leadership figures of the Rif, but also was regarded with some suspicion, in particular their relationship with the sea. Bin Abdelkrim ordered the Bukoya's boats to be collected and held under surveillance in harbour, and also established garrisons in Bukoya territory. Similarly, Bin Abdelkrim ordered a surprise attack on the Galaya villages. The Rifian fleet, the regular Rifian soldiers, were sent overnight by land to take the Galaya boats and bring them directly under the control of the Republic of the Rif. So, in conclusion, I would say that the Republic at sea ended with Bin Abdelkrim. Piracy flourished in the period before the Rif War, but was virtually non-existent during the war itself. It's very possible that was due to a lack of opportunities, that European commercial shipping was steering clear of the coast. But piracy, like banditry, flourished in the absence of the state. And with the imposition of state control by Bin Abdelkrim, piracy, like banditry, was suborned or extirpated altogether. The focus of the Rifian state was on its immediate needs, transport and supplies. There was no priority given to freelance activity like piracy. There was no sense in keeping sailors ready for the occasions when foreign shipping might get too close to the coast. Pirate networks were diverted to wartime aims. So this is really not a story about piracy as such. It's more a story about how coastal communities were brought in, willing or not, to service the Rifian war machine. This was an attempt by the Republic of the Rif to control and to dominate the northern coast as the frontier facing Europe. So ultimately, the Rifian state was utterly unlike an anarchic, piratical republic. In its totalizing character and its attempt to subordinate individual desires to the national cause, it looks much more like a modern state. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, James, pour ce respect très méticuleux du temps, cet exposé très clair. On va passer tout de suite à la communication de Mohamed et rassembler les questions à la fin. Donc, je vais vous demander de changer de place.